Umunze was a village where stories traveled faster than the wind. A place where a chicken sneezing could spark rumors of a plague, and no secret stayed hidden for long. Nestled between rolling hills and dusty paths, it thrived on two things: farming and gossip. But nothing entertained the villagers more than the peculiar lives of others, especially when those lives involved Nneka and Nnedi, the identical dwarf twins whose bond was tighter than the knots in an old fisherman's net. Nneka and Nnedi were as inseparable as shadows at noon. Their short stature only amplified their presence because, despite their size, their personalities were larger than life. Known for their sharp tongues and sharper wit, they moved through Umunze like a whirlwind, leaving trails of laughter, whispers, and sometimes outright chaos. But it wasn't until they married Ubanna, a tall, dark man in his early 50s, that their story took a turn that even Umunze's most imaginative gossips couldn't have predicted. Ubanna was the kind of man who turned heads not because he was handsome, though some said he had the charm of a trickster god, but because he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed the sun rose just to see his face. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dark as freshly roasted palm kernels, he was a man who believed he'd seen it all. But even Ubanna wasn't prepared for the storm that was Nneka and Nnedi. When he first laid eyes on them at the village square, he didn't see trouble. No, he saw an opportunity to identical women who adored him equally. He thought, double the wives, double the love. What he didn't realize was that it also meant double the drama, double the jealousy, and eventually, double the trouble. Ubanna's proposal wasn't the romantic tale villagers would sing about. It was more of a performance, loud, dramatic, and laced with just the right amount of arrogance. One sunny afternoon, beneath a giant iroko tree in Umunze's bustling square, Ubanna stood tall, his voice booming over the chatter of market women and restless goats. He declared his love for Nneka and Nnedi, proclaiming he wanted not one, but both of them as his wives. The crowd gasped, then erupted into laughter. After all, who proposes to two women at once, especially twin sisters? But the laughter didn't faze Ubanna. His chest puffed with pride as he waited for their response. Nneka and Nnedi exchanged glances, their identical faces mirroring mischief and delight. They had always done everything together, shared toys, clothes, secrets, so why not a husband? Without missing a beat, they both said yes, their voices harmonizing like a well-rehearsed chorus. The villagers' laughter turned to murmurs of disbelief. Some whispered that Ubanna was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. Most bet on the latter. The wedding was a spectacle. It wasn't the lavish decorations or the abundance of food that made it memorable. It was the absurdity of it all. Two brides in matching dresses, standing side by side, clutching identical bouquets, glaring at each other every time one smiled a little too brightly at Ubanna. The ceremony was filled with awkward pauses, forced laughter, and a priest who stumbled through his words, unsure if he should say, "Do you, Ubanna, take these women, or do you take this woman?" The villagers attended in droves, not out of love but curiosity. Some hid their amusement behind poorly suppressed chuckles. Others openly placed bets on how long the marriage would last. Ubanna, oblivious to the undercurrent of mockery, stood proudly between his brides, convinced he had achieved something extraordinary. Nneka and Nnedi, meanwhile, basked in the attention, unaware that their fairy tale was already unraveling thread by fragile thread. The honeymoon phase, if it could even be called that, was a comedy of errors from the start. Ubanna, proud of his double conquest, thought he'd entered a paradise filled with affection and harmony. Instead, he found himself trapped in a circus, juggling egos with the grace of a drunk performer. Nneka wanted to sleep on his left side because she claimed it was his heart side, while Nnedi insisted the right side made her feel closer to his soul. The compromise, Ubanna often found himself wedged awkwardly in the middle, suffocating under two sets of possessive arms. Their new home quickly turned into a battleground disguised as a household. Mornings were filled with passive-aggressive competitions: who could make the tastier breakfast, who dressed Ubanna's bed better, and who picked the right color of wrapper to complement his skin tone. Even the simplest tasks became points of contention. One day, Nneka claimed she was the only one who could properly wash Ubanna's clothes because she knew how to fold his spiritual energy into the fabric. Nnedi responded by ironing his trousers with such fury that she burned a hole straight through them, declaring, "At least my love is hot enough to leave a mark." Ubanna soon realized he wasn't the king of this castle. He was the spoils of war in an endless battle between identical queens. Ubanna's patience were thinner than his favorite rapper. What he thought would be a life of doubled affection turned into doubled headaches. The twins' jealousy was relentless, their love a battlefield where he was both the prize and the casualty. Conversations felt like walking through a minefield, one wrong word, one misplaced compliment, and he'd spark another explosion. One evening, he returned from the farm exhausted, only to find the twins waiting like sentinels. Nneka had prepared a pot of steaming egusi soup. Nnedi had made a bowl of spicy okra. Both dishes sat on the table like ticking time bombs. "Which one do you prefer, husband?" Nneka asked sweetly, her smile as sharp as a knife. Ubanna, sensing danger, tried to be diplomatic. "I love both equally," he replied, forcing a grin. But diplomacy had no place in this war. The next morning, he discovered his favorite shirt mysteriously shredded and his sandals, missing silent punishments from the twin, who felt less favored. The villagers, of course, noticed. They watched from a distance, whispering, laughing, shaking their heads. Ubanna, once the proud man who believed he could handle double the love, now walked with slumped shoulders and the haunted look of someone who'd made a very costly mistake. As days turned into weeks, the tension in Ubanna's household grew thicker than the midday heat. Nneka and Nnedi's sisterly bond, once unbreakable, now showed cracks, spider-webbed with jealousy and silent resentment. Every smile Ubanna gave, every glance he stole, every word he spoke became ammunition in their unspoken war. The twins, once inseparable, now engaged in battles masked as household chores. If Nneka fetched water, Nnedi fetched more. If Nnedi cooked a meal, Nneka added extra spices, claiming she knew Ubanna's true taste. Their petty competitions escalated into full-blown arguments, with plates and insults flying through the air like arrows in battle. Ubanna often escaped the village square, claiming farm duties, but everyone knew he was running from the chaos he had married into. At night, when the world was silent, the walls of their home echoed with whispered accusations. "You touched him longer today," Nneka would hiss. "You smiled too sweetly at him," Nnedi would retort. Ubanna pretended to sleep, his heart pounding like a drum, wishing for the simplicity of bachelorhood. In Umunze, nothing stayed hidden for long. The twins' escalating drama became the village's favorite source of entertainment. At the palm wine tap, men chuckled over Ubanna's misfortune, shaking their heads with mock sympathy. The women at the stream exchanged exaggerated tales, adding colorful details with each retelling. "Did you hear? Nneka tried to poison Nnedi's soup," one would whisper. "No, no, I heard Nnedi cursed Ubanna's yam harvest," another would claim. The twins, oblivious to how loud their chaos had become, continued their daily battles, unknowingly providing front row seats to Umunze's unofficial village comedy. Children made up songs about them, with catchy rhymes like, "Two wives, one man, what a plan, fight all day, cry if you can." Ubanna, once proud of his bold marriage, now walked with his head low, haunted not just by the chaos at home, but by the echoes of laughter following him through the village paths. The man who thought he'd married double the love had instead found himself at the heart of a joke that refused to end. Ubanna's patience, once as sturdy as the ancient Iroko tree in the village square, had withered to a brittle twig. Every day felt like a repeat of the last petty arguments, dramatic outbursts, and the exhausting tug-of-war over his affection. His once proud chest now slumped with weariness, his booming voice reduced to tired sighs. The house, which he'd imagined filled with laughter and warmth, felt more like a prison with walls closing in. One evening, after enduring yet another heated argument over whose stew was spicier, both equally inedible, thanks to their rivalry, Ubanna snapped, slamming his calabash of palm wine on the table. He roared, "Am I food to be shared and tasted? Am I a pot of soup to be measured by spoons?" The twins froze, shocked into rare silence. But the calm lasted only a heartbeat before Nneka retorted, "Maybe if you chose wisely, we wouldn't have to fight." Nnedi quickly chimed in, "Yes, maybe if you weren't so weak, we wouldn't need to compete." Ubanna stormed out, slamming the door behind him, his footsteps echoing through the village night. He sought refuge at the local palm wine joint, drowning his frustration in calabash after calabash. The villagers watched him with knowing smirks, whispering behind their drinks, "Ah, the mighty man with two wives can't even handle one." As Ubanna's absences grew longer, the twins found themselves alone with their bitterness. Their love for Ubanna had twisted into something dark, a mixture of resentment and possessiveness. Their once shared laughter was replaced by tense silences and side-eyed glares. Every night, they rehashed old grievances, their words sharp enough to cut through the thick village air. One particularly stormy evening, as rain pounded on the thatched roof, Nneka voiced the thought that had been lurking like a shadow in both their minds. Maybe life would be easier without him. The words hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Nnedi didn't respond immediately. She stared into the flickering flame of their lantern, her face expressionless, but her silence spoke volumes. The idea, once whispered in frustration, grew roots in their minds. They convinced themselves that Ubanna was the problem, that his favoritism had poisoned their bond. If he were gone, things would return to how they were, just the two of them, inseparable and unchallenged. Their plan formed not out of pure malice, but from the toxic belief that removing him would restore their twisted version of peace. Outside, the storm raged on, as if the heavens themselves sensed the darkness brewing inside that small, crumbling house. The night they chose to end Ubanna's life was deceptively quiet. No storm, no wind, just the suffocating stillness of impending doom. The twins had planned everything down to the smallest detail. A simple meal laced with a concoction of crushed, bitter roots and herbs, known to cause a peaceful sleep, at least according to old village tales. Nneka cooked the food with a steady hand while Nnedi stood watch, her face blank, betraying none of the fear that gnawed at her heart. Ubanna returned home drunk, as usual, his steps unsteady, his breath heavy with the sour scent of palm wine. He slumped onto his mat, mumbling about the foolishness of marrying two women with the same face but opposite tempers. The twins served his favorite dish, pounded yam and spicy egusi, soup seasoned with more than just bitterness. Ubanna, too intoxicated to notice the faint tremor in Nneka's hands or the way Nnedi's eyes refused to meet his, ate without suspicion. Hours later, the house was filled with silence, broken only by Ubanna's laboured breathing as the poison took hold. The twins sat beside him, their expressions unreadable, until finally his breath stopped. No screams, no struggle, just a man fading into the darkness, betrayed by the very hands that once cared for him. Ubanna's funeral was swift and simple, as was customary, but the air in Umunze was thick with more than just grief. Whispers crept like shadows through the crowd, growing louder with each passing day. He was too young to die suddenly. Did you see how calm the wives were? Strange, isn't it? The villagers, always hungry for gossip, feasted on the mystery surrounding Ubanna's death. Nneka and Nnedi played their parts well, wearing sorrow like ill-fitting clothes. They cried when expected, bowed their heads just low enough, and accepted condolences with practiced grace. But grief didn't cling to them as it should have. Their eyes, sharp and calculating, betrayed none of the emptiness that comes with true loss. Back home, without Ubanna's presence, the house felt hollow. They had expected relief, maybe even peace, but what settled over them was an unsettling, quiet and absence that echoed louder than Ubanna's drunken rants ever had. Worse still, the bond they thought would heal after his death felt strained, stretched thin by guilt and unspoken truths. The villagers kept their distance, their eyes sharp with suspicion masked as sympathy, and though no one spoke it aloud, everyone in Umunze knew something wasn't right about the way Ubanna died. The days following the funeral felt heavier than the soil on Ubanna's grave. Nneka and Nnedi moved through Umunze like shadows, aware of the invisible fingers pointing at them. The villagers' whispers followed them everywhere, at the market, at the stream, even during evening gatherings. Conversations would abruptly halt when they approached, replaced by forced smiles and hollow greetings. It was as if they were ghosts haunting their own lives. At first, the twins tried to ignore it, clinging to the belief that time would make people forget. But the whispers grew roots, sprouting rumors that twisted and tangled like wild vines. Did you hear Ubanna's spirit haunts their house? They didn't shed real tears at the funeral. No one dies suddenly without a reason. Nneka's temper flared often, snapping at villagers over petty issues. Nnedi grew quieter, her guilt tucked behind distant stares. One evening, as they fetched water from the stream, a group of children sang a new rhyme. Two sisters, one man. Gone too soon, that was the plan. Cried no tears, felt no pain. Now they walk with ghostly shame. The song stuck more than any accusation. Nneka chased the children away, her face burning with rage and humiliation, while Nnedi stood frozen, the melody echoing in her head long after the voices had faded, unable to bear the suffocating judgment of the villagers. Nneka and Nnedi made a decision: they would return to their father's house. They believed that home, the place where their bond had been strongest, would offer refuge from the world's prying eyes. Their father, an old man with weary eyes and a heart hardened by life's disappointments, welcomed them with reluctant acceptance. He had never fully understood his daughter's obsession with doing everything together, but he said nothing, only nodding as they settled back into the small, creaking house. But peace was as absent here as it was in Ubanna's home. The walls whispered reminders of the life they'd left behind, and the life they'd taken. Nights were the worst. Nneka often woke up drenched in sweat, claiming she heard Ubanna's voice calling her name. Nnedi, haunted by her own guilt, started talking in her sleep, muttering apologies to someone only she could see. Their father noticed their restlessness, the dark circles under their eyes, the way they flinched at sudden noises, but he said nothing. In Umunze, silence was often the preferred way of dealing with uncomfortable truths. Still, even silence couldn't drown out the weight of what they'd done, or the reality that no matter where they went, they couldn't escape themselves. Back in their father's house, Nneka and Nnedi expected to find comfort in the familiarity of their childhood home. Instead, they found themselves trapped in an even deeper loneliness. The house, once filled with the laughter of two inseparable girls, now felt like a cage, its walls echoing with memories they could no longer bear. Their father, too old and too tired to question their return, kept his distance, offering only grunts and brief nods when they spoke. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of their guilt grew heavier. They had thought removing Ubanna from their lives would bring them closer, but instead, an invisible wall stood between them, a wall built from silent accusations and unspoken regrets. Nneka became restless, pacing the house like a trapped animal, while Nnedi withdrew into herself, staring out of windows as if searching for something or someone who could never return. The villagers' whispers didn't stop, they merely shifted locations. Now, curious neighbors visited under the guise of politeness, their words dripping with thinly veiled suspicion. "How are you coping without your husband?" they'd ask with full sympathy, their eyes glinting with curiosity. The twins would smile, tight-lipped and brittle, knowing that every word they spoke fed the ever-growing rumor mill. But the worst part wasn't the gossip, it was the realization that no man dared to approach them. Suitors, once intrigued by the novelty of marrying identical twins, now avoided them like a cursed legend. Marriage proposals never came, and the few men who passed their way did so with quick steps and downcast eyes. The twins had not only lost their husband, they had lost their future. Despite the growing stigma, Nneka and Nnedi remained, stubborn in their belief that they could still find a man willing to marry them together. They dressed in their finest clothes, painted their faces with bright colors, and attended every village gathering. Their identical beauty undimmed by grief or guilt, they believed that someone, somewhere, would find them irresistible. But reality was cruel. Suitors who once admired their uniqueness now saw only a tragic tale wrapped in suspicion. Men whispered to each other, "Marry them," and end up like Ubanna. "No, thank you." Some claimed the twins were cursed, doomed to bring misfortune to any man foolish enough to claim them. As rejection after rejection piled up, Nneka's frustration boiled over. "They're just afraid of strong women," she'd snap, her pride shielding her from the sting of rejection. Nnedi, however, grew quieter, the rejection cutting deeper with each passing day. She began to wonder if the villagers were right, if they truly were cursed, not by spirits, but by their own choices. One evening, after another failed attempt to attract a suitor, Nneka stared into the dying embers of their cooking fire and muttered, "We don't need them, we have each other." But even as she spoke the words, a hollow ache settled in her chest, one that no sisterly bond could ever fill. The twins had won the battle against Ubanna, but lost the war against themselves. The twins' pride was both their greatest strength and their deepest wound. They refused to acknowledge that they were being shunned, choosing instead to maintain their stance that they had done nothing wrong. After all, hadn't they simply followed their hearts? But as the days wore on, their heartache grew more unbearable, and their pride began to feel like an iron chain dragging them deeper into isolation. Nneka became increasingly defiant. She would strut through the village with her head held high, pretending not to notice the whispers that followed her like a shadow. If anyone dared question her decision, she would snap back with sharp retorts, asserting that no one had the right to judge her life. "Who says a woman can't have what she wants? I'm free to live as I choose," she would declare, though her words rang hollow even to her own ears. Nnedi, on the other hand, withdrew even further. She spent more and more time by herself, often lost in thought by the riverbank, staring into the water as if searching for answers that didn't exist. At night, she would toss and turn in bed, unable to silence the voices in her head that whispered what if? What if they had married separately? What if they had let Ubanna go? What if their lives hadn't spiraled into tragedy? But these thoughts were too painful to confront. So, she she buried them deep, locking them away under layers of pride and defiance. And though she tried to convince herself that she was fine, the truth was that she wasn't. Neither of them was. But these thoughts were too painful to confront. So, she buried them deep, locking them away under layers of pride and defiance. And though she tried to convince herself that she was fine, the truth was that she wasn't. Neither of them was. One fateful afternoon, as the twins sat in the shade of the family's small compound, a visitor arrived, an unexpected one. The village elder, a man of many years and little patience for drama, approached their house with a serious expression etched into his weathered face. He was known for his bluntness, and no one, not even the most powerful of families, dared ignore him. "Your father has sent for you," he announced, his voice steady but sharp. The twins looked up, surprised. Their father had been quiet for weeks, his health failing, his mind turning inward as if weighed down by the ghosts of his past. The elder paused before adding, "There are things that need to be settled. Come with me." Without asking for more details, the twins followed the elder through the village, their hearts pounding in their chests. They reached their father's hut, where he sat, frail and small in his chair, eyes cloudy with age and regret. The silence between them was thick, but the elder's voice broke through. "You must marry separately," he said, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. The twins froze, shock rippling through them. Their father, whose silence had been their shield, was finally speaking the truth they'd avoided for so long. "You have brought shame upon your family with your choices, and now you must find your own paths. Do not wait for a man to find you. Do not wait for what was lost." For the first time in years, the twins were forced to confront the reality they had run from. Their father's words, though harsh, were clear. The past could not be undone, and their pride could not protect them forever. The elder's words hung in the air like the oppressive heat of midday. Nneka and Nnedi stood before their father, speechless. As the weight of his ultimatum settled upon them, the quiet of the hut felt suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The twins exchanged a look, one that spoke volumes of their shared history, of their defiance, their rivalry, and the choices that had led them here. Nneka, ever the more outspoken, was the first to break the silence. "Why now?" she asked, her voice strained with confusion and frustration. "After everything we've been through, why tell us this now? Are we supposed to just forget everything we've built?" Her words were bitter, a mix of anger and desperation, but there was no denying the truth they held. Their entire lives had been defined by their refusal to separate. To hear their father, who had never fully understood their bond, demand that they ended now, felt like a betrayal. Nnedi, however, remained silent, her eyes downcast as she mulled over their father's words. Deep inside, she knew he was right. They had brought shame upon their family, but admitting it was too painful. Her heart ached as the realization sunk in they had lost their way. Their defiance had led them to this bitter end, and no amount of pride could reverse the damage. The elder, sensing the twins' internal conflict, spoke again, his voice soft but firm. "The bond you share is strong, but it is not enough to sustain you. A man will not define you, nor should you rely on him for your happiness. Your path forward is yours to choose, but it must be separate if you wish to find peace." The twins returned home, that day with more than just their father's words weighing on them. They carried a truth that was difficult to accept. They had to change. As they sat together by the fire that evening, the house felt smaller than ever, as if the walls were closing in on their past mistakes. The world outside seemed distant, unreachable. For the first time, Nneka spoke softly. "What if we did marry separately? What if we let go of this idea that we must always be together?" She looked at Nnedi, her expression vulnerable, no longer filled with the fiery defiance she once carried. "Maybe it's time to change." Nnedi, still lost in thought, finally nodded. The thought of living without the other by her side was terrifying, but the idea of remaining trapped in their endless cycle of rivalry and shame was worse. "Maybe it's the only way we can find peace, for ourselves and for father." They spent the night in deep conversation, discussing what it would mean to let go of their stubbornness and start anew. It was a painful thought, but it was the only option left if they wanted to escape the shadow of their past. The next morning, as the sun rose over Umunze, the twins stood together once more, facing the future with a mix of fear and hope. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, they felt a glimmer of possibility. The days that followed were filled with the kind of quiet reflection the twins had long avoided. It wasn't easy, change never was, but with each passing day, Nneka and Nnedi felt a shift deep within them, as if the walls around their hearts were slowly crumbling. They began to realize that their bond didn't need to be defined by their shared misery or their stubbornness. They could still be close, still be sisters, but they no longer needed to cling to the idea of always being one unit, always together. One afternoon, after weeks of quiet introspection, Nneka spoke up, her voice steady but full of determination. "I think it's time," she said, turning to Nnedi with a serious look in her eyes. "We've spent too long hiding from ourselves, from the truth. We have to let go." Nnedi, who had been gazing out at the horizon, turned toward her sister. The weight of their father's words still hung heavily in the air, but now she saw the path forward not as an end, but as a new chapter, one where they could choose their own futures. "Yes," she agreed, her voice calm but firm. "Let's move forward separately. It's the only way to heal." And so, they began the delicate process of reinventing their lives, not as two halves of a whole, but as two individuals, each with their own desires, their own goals. They didn't need a man to define them, and they didn't need each other to survive. They would still share their lives, their joys and their sorrows, but in a way that was no longer suffocating or overshadowed by guilt. The news of the twins' change in mindset spread quickly through Umunze, as the village could never resist the allure of a good story. Many of the men who had once feared the curse of marrying the twins began to approach them cautiously, no longer intimidated by the shadow of Ubanna's death. They had heard the rumors. Of course, the twins had done something terrible, something unspoken, but the air had shifted. Nneka and Nnedi were no longer seen as a threat. They were simply two women who had endured much and were now, it seemed, ready to live independently. And so, one by one, suitors appeared at their father's house, not with arrogance or pride, but with respect. They offered their intentions openly, not for the sake of having two wives, but as individuals. The twins, however, remained cautious. The memory of Ubanna, his death, and the judgments of the villagers was still fresh in their minds, and while the prospect of a new life was tempting, they were not ready to jump into it blindly. Nneka met one suitor, a young man named Chijiok, who seemed to see her not as a novelty, but as a woman in her own right. He didn't flinch when she explained her past, and instead, he nodded in understanding. "I've heard the stories," he said softly, "but I see you for who you are. If you're willing, I would like to get to know you better." Nnedi, too, met a man, Umunze, who was older, kind-hearted, and patient. He didn't rush her. He simply offered companionship without pressure, understanding that she needed time to heal from her past. While the suitor's interest was flattering, the twins' minds were still not at peace. Nneka and Nnedi had spent years bound to each other, their lives intricately woven together in ways they could barely comprehend. Now, they had to navigate the delicate balance of being independent, without losing the essence of who they were. Nneka, ever the bold one, found herself struggling the most. She was afraid of being alone, afraid of not being enough without Nnedi by her side. She would often retreat into herself, questioning whether she was truly ready for the changes that were unfolding. "What if I'm making a mistake?" she would ask, her voice small and vulnerable, a side of her that no one had seen in years. Nnedi, though quieter, felt the same doubts. She had spent so much of her life believing that her sister and Ubanna were the only constants, that the thought of having her own life, her own future, felt alien. "We're still sisters, no matter what," she would remind herself, trying to cling to the one thing that had always been certain. But even as the struggle continued within, there was a glimmer of hope, a small, tentative belief that they were moving towards something better, something that didn't require them to live in the shadow of their past. As the weeks passed, Nneka and Nnedi continued to test the waters of independence, each taking small steps toward their own futures. Yet, no matter how hard they tried to walk alone, the ties that bound them to each other remained strong. They found themselves often sitting together, reminiscing about the days when they shared everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly. There was a comfort in these moments, a reminder that, while they were growing apart in some ways, they would always be sisters. Nneka, who had always been the more outspoken one, found solace in these quiet conversations. They weren't about their past mistakes or the rumors of the village. They were about the future, about the possibility of finding their own happiness without relying on anyone else. But even as she spoke about her hopes, a part of her wondered if she was fooling herself. Could she really let go of her sister? Could they both truly walk different paths and still remain connected in the way they once were? Nnedi, in contrast, was more introspective. The changes felt slower to her, like a seed growing in the soil, an uncertain process with no guarantee of success. Still, she found herself thinking about the future more often, about the life she could have outside of the shadow of their shared past. She had never believed in the idea of marriage for the sake of tradition, but now she was open to the idea of finding someone who would understand her for who she was, not for the woman she had been before. One evening, as the twins sat outside their father's house watching the sunset, Nneka finally spoke the words that had been weighing on her heart for days. Do you think we'll ever be able to truly let go of the past? Of what we did to Ubanna? She asked quietly, her voice uncertain. Nnedi turned to her, her face thoughtful. I don't know, she said honestly, but I think we're on the right path. We're not running from it anymore. We're facing it, and that's something. The conversation left both sisters with more questions than answers, but it also gave them a sense of peace. They didn't have to have everything figured out right away. The future was a journey, and they would walk it, side by side yet apart, taking the steps they needed to take. Just when the twins began to believe that they were ready to embrace the future, doubt crept in once again. The weight of their past had always been there, but now it felt heavier than ever. The village had accepted their return, at least on the surface, but the judgment was never far from the surface. One day, Nneka and Nnedi decided to attend a gathering at the village square. It was a rare opportunity for the villagers to come together, and they hoped that the casual atmosphere would offer a chance to test the waters of acceptance. They entered the square together, their backs straight and their heads held high. But as soon as they stepped into the crowd, the whispers started. First, it was a few harsh comments from the older women, then some giggles from the younger men. The twins tried to ignore it, but the sting was undeniable. A young man named Nneka, who had been a suitor of Nneka's in the past, approached them with a forced smile. It's good to see you both out and about, he said, but his words were laced with something less than warmth. Nneka could feel the weight of his gaze, and she turned away, her pride flaring. You don't need to pretend, Nneka, she snapped. We know what people say. The words hit harder than she intended, but they felt true. She was tired of the judgment, tired of feeling like an outcast in her own village. Nnedi, sensing the tension, reached for her sister's hand, trying to calm her. Let's just go home, she murmured. As they walked away, the whispers followed them, but this time, Nneka didn't feel as angry. She felt tired of carrying the weight of expectations, of guilt, of pride. She realized, in that moment, that even though they had taken steps to change, they would never be fully free of their past. But perhaps that was okay. Perhaps they didn't need to be perfect, just honest. The twins returned to their father's house after the gathering was quiet, the usual chatter between them subdued by the weight of their earlier encounter. Neither spoke much as they sat in the dim light of the evening, both processing the bitter taste of rejection that still lingered in their mouths. But as the night wore on, a sense of calm settled over them, a quiet resilience born of their shared experience. Nneka, who had always been the one to speak out when things went wrong, sat in silence. The evening's humiliation still stuck, but she had come to realize that the judgment from the village no longer had the power it once did. Yes, they had made mistakes. Yes, they had lived through a tragedy, but it didn't define them anymore. They were still alive, still breathing, still moving forward, and that was enough. Nnedi, ever the quiet one, was deep in thought, her mind turning over the day's events. She, too, had felt the sting of the villagers' whispers, but unlike Nneka, she had not been consumed by anger. Instead, she saw the moment for what it was, a reminder that the world would not easily forgive them. But that didn't matter. What mattered was how they saw themselves. They were sisters, and that bond was stronger than any gossip or judgment. I think we're stronger than we give ourselves credit for, Nnedi said softly, breaking the silence. We've survived worse, and we'll keep surviving. Nneka nodded, her eyes meeting her sister's. You're right. We don't need their approval. We just need to keep moving forward together. And so, in the quiet of the night, the twins found a sense of peace. They might never be free of their past, but they no longer had to live in it. The future was waiting, and for the first time in a long while, they were ready to embrace it not as one, but as two individuals with their own paths to follow. As the weeks turned into months, Nneka and Nnedi began to find their rhythm. Each day was a step toward rebuilding their lives, but the road ahead was still fraught with uncertainty. The suitors continued to show interest, and while the twins were more open to the idea of finding love, the fear of repeating past mistakes loomed over them. Nneka, in particular, struggled with the idea of giving herself fully to someone again. After Ubanna, the idea of placing her trust in another man seemed both tempting and terrifying. She longed for companionship, for the warmth of love, but the thought of repeating history filled her with dread. "What if we end up just like we did with Ubanna?" she asked Nnedi one evening, her voice tight with worry. Nnedi, ever the steady presence in Nneka's life, gave her sister a reassuring smile. "We're not the same people we were. We've learned from our mistakes, and even if we make new ones, we'll handle them differently. We're stronger now." The truth in Nnedi's words settled in Nneka's chest, but the fear didn't completely fade. It was a quiet companion, always there, whispering doubts in the back of her mind. But Nneka knew that living in fear was no way to live at all. If she wanted a future, she would have to take that step forward, even with the uncertainty. Nnedi, too, faced her own fears. The idea of opening her heart again seemed foreign to her, like a door she had closed long ago. But as the days passed, she found herself thinking about the possibility of love, not as an obligation, but as something she might choose for herself. Perhaps it was time to let someone in, not to replace what was lost, but to create something new, something of her own. It was on a warm afternoon, as the sun bathed the village of Umunze in golden light, that the twins found themselves at a crossroads once more. The air was thick with anticipation as a suitor approached. Nneka, his name was Chijioke, the same young man who had expressed his interest before. He had been patient, giving Nneka the space she needed, and now he was back this time with a serious proposal. "I know the road hasn't been easy for you," Nneka, Chijioke said, his voice calm and steady. "But I've seen you for who you are, and I believe in you, not because of your past, but because of who you are now. I want to walk this path with you, if you'll let me." Nneka, still wrestling with the fear of opening her heart, found herself stunned by his sincerity. His words, simple yet profound, made her heart beat faster. Could it be possible to trust again, to love again? The thought terrified her, but there was something in his gaze, something in the way he spoke, that made her want to believe. "I don't know if I can," she admitted, her voice shaky. "I've been hurt before, Chijioke, and I'm scared." Chijioke nodded, his expression full of understanding. "I don't expect you to forget. I just want to be here for you. I'll wait as long as it takes." Meanwhile, Nnedi, watching from a distance, felt a pang of envy mixed with admiration. She hadn't yet opened herself up to the possibility of love, and yet here was her sister, standing on the precipice of a new beginning. She had always feared love, but now she began to wonder, could she, too, find someone who would understand her, who would offer her the same patience and understanding that Chijioke had shown Nneka? For the first time in a long while, Nneka felt a flicker of hope, something she hadn't dared to feel in years. Perhaps there was a future for her after all, one not defined by the past, but shaped by the choices she made moving. Days passed, and the twins wrestled with their feelings. Nneka, torn between the love she had for her sister and the potential love she could have with Chijioke, found herself at a standstill. She had never imagined this day would come, the day when she might choose someone else over the bond she had shared with Nnedi. But love, as it often did, was forcing her to confront difficult truths. One evening, as the sun began to set, Nneka turned to Nnedi with a question that had been haunting her for days. "What do you think I should do, Nnedi? He's offering me something real, but I don't know if I can let go of us." Nnedi, who had been silent for most of the week, looked at her sister, her eyes filled with both understanding and sadness. "Nneka," she said gently, "I want you to be happy. I want you to choose what's best for you. I know it's hard, but you've spent so long carrying the weight of our past. Maybe it's time to build a future, not just for us, but for you." Her words struck Nneka deeply. Nnedi was right. They had spent so many years living in the shadow of their past mistakes, of their dependence on each other, that they had forgotten what it meant to truly live for themselves. It was time for Nneka to take that step, not just for her sister, but for herself. Nneka turned to Chijioke that evening, her heart pounding. "I'm ready," she said softly. "I'm ready to take a chance." With Chijioke's gentle support, Nneka began to embrace a life she had never thought possible. She allowed herself to open up, to trust again, and to love not out of obligation, but because she had found someone who valued her for who she truly was. Nnedi, too, began to explore the idea of love on her own terms, though she still moved slowly, unsure of where her heart would lead her. The village of Umunze, once filled with whispers and judgment, began to accept the twins once again, not as the outcasts they had been, but as individuals who had taken control of their own destinies. Their bond, though changed, remained strong, built not on the idea of never being apart, but on the love and respect they had for one another. Nneka and Nnedi had finally learned that love was not about never separating, never growing apart. It was about finding your own path while still holding onto the love you shared. They were no longer bound by the past, but free to walk into the future, side by side, yet apart. As the sun set over Umunze, the twins stood together, ready to face whatever came next, and for the first time in years, they felt ready to embrace it, whatever that might be.